Good day and greetings from Pretoria, South Africa. My name is Dr. Charles Cotter. I'd like to welcome you to episode 3 of the Power Skills for Leadership online learning program. The focus of episode 3 is to look at the 12 negotiation principles. These negotiation principles are based on my business management research over a number of years, and I'd like to share them with you as a means of improving your negotiation skills. This will be part of a broader online learning program where we often look at the 4 P's of negotiation. In other words, that's the principles, the proficiency, in particular the competency profile, but also looking at the practice, so your preferred or default negotiation style, and then also concluding by looking at the negotiation process, which is a 4-phase process. However, today's episode then focuses on those 12 negotiation principles. I hope you enjoyed the learning content, and I look forward to further learning engagement. So you'll see the first code of best practice principle is, I think a few of you have alluded to this with your introduction. We need to constantly seek out win-win, mutually beneficial agreements, solutions, and outcomes. So please take note of the terminology there. When you talk about agreement, generally you talk about a short term. When you talk about a solution, it's usually the time horizon is the medium term. But of course, when you talk about the outcomes tend to be sustainable. So we talk about the long-term time horizon. So I think for me, the very important lesson here is, apart from seeking out these win-win mutually beneficial agreements, we should also try to make them medium to long-term relevant. In other words, seeking out solutions where there is potential conflict, but also making sure that the outcomes are sustainable. So you'll see later on in the learning manual, there's some literature in this regard, but just related to this, there's a clear shift, therefore, from distributive to integrative, in other words, mutual gain bargaining. I think it's very important. So again, just measure your degree of compliance with your most recent workplace negotiation. Did you seek out those win-win mutually beneficial agreements? Was there positive solutions and outcomes that flowed and emanated from that negotiation? And did you apply integrative as opposed to distributive, in other words, mutual gain bargaining during that negotiation process? The second principle that we need to comply with is we need to make sure that the negotiation process in particular is constructive and not destructive. And you'll see very shortly, I've clustered the first 4 together, and I've also clustered principle 5 and 6 together. And I've got a specific quote that I'd like to share with you, which I think captures the essence of the first 4 principles in particular. So again, just indicate whether the process was constructive, or was the negotiation process that you recently engaged in, was it a rather destructive process? The third best practice principle that we need to comply with is we need to shift from competition, Charmaine, to collaboration and ultimately cooperation. So you'll see those of you that completed the negotiation styles questionnaire, there are 2 important variables that we need to look at. The first, of course, is cooperation, and the second one is assertiveness. And that, based on those 2 variables and those 2 criteria, you are able then to plot. And I'm going to help you with the plotting just to have a very accurate gauge of your default, your preferred negotiation style. And like I said, we need to shift from the alienation, the potential alienation, especially where the negotiation was destructive. We need to shift to allegiance. So we need to somehow, I think some of you, given the seniority of your management position, you will often agree that the strategic ambition is to create these strategic alliances. And of course, that would be a very positive outcome. So if we can then shift from competition, I win at your expense, a win-lose sort of context or configuration, to a win-win, collaborative, sort of cooperative, like I said, creating allegiance and ultimately the strategic alliances, I really think that would be beneficial to all parties engaged in the negotiation process. Related to that, number 4, the person that you, or the parties that you're negotiating with, I don't think you should see them as combatants. I think you should see them as a counterpart. And I think this terminology is also reflected in the reading article, which we'll get to later on this afternoon. But I think you'll agree with me, the negotiation currency that you need to trade in is, of course, value. Value is the most important currency of the negotiation process. And you'll see later on, we're going to talk about claiming value relative to creating value. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but certainly we'll come back to that. But certainly always view the other party to the negotiation process as a counterpart and not as a combatant. So maybe I could just, based on those first 4 principles, move to this transition, and you could see collectively how those first 4 principles really speak
to this particular quote. So as it says there, in the business world, the process that pits one party against the other and identifies a winner and a loser is ill-suited for devising remedies that work. What is needed then are approaches, frameworks, strategies, and tactics that advance constructive negotiation. So, like I said, I'm positioning the first four principles in that sense. And I think it's really collectively, almost the umbrella is, of course, that constructive and that meaningful engagement and ultimately the dialogue. Principle number 5 is we need to shift from power, in particular positional power, where we're using our managerial muscles, we're flexing them, we're using authority. We need to shift to influence. And those of you that, especially from a strong sales and marketing background, you'll remember this Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, which basically says that if you want to influence or persuade somebody, you have to look at 3 very important checkpoints. Loosely translated, Aristotle spoke about logos, the pathos, and the ethos. So logos is the logical argument, the business case, the statistical facts, the evidence, etc. But according to Aristotle, that's not good enough to influence and to persuade somebody. You have to win over their hearts as well. Winning over their heads with your business case, but then winning over their hearts. So we need to have a very compelling, inspirational message. And of course, that will then win over their hearts. And of course, the ethos, loosely translated, speaks to the ethics. So you need to be perceived as an ethical source by your counterpart if they don't see you as an ethical source. So as it says that the logic, the reasoning, the argumentation, facts, figures, even using case studies, feasibility studies, etc. The emotion. So you have to sometimes, and I think Susan, the life coaches often rely a lot on storytelling. So that is a way of sort of unlocking or evoking emotion. And of course, that is then the quickest that you win people over, get their buy-in, and you have that sense of ownership. And people are committed to the agreements, not because they have to, but because they want to. So those agreements, the solutions, and ultimately the outcomes are fueled by commitment and not compliance. And then, of course, you need to be perceived as a credible source of information. And I just want to briefly touch on it, and certainly it'll resurface later on during the morning session. But I think the key word there is, of course, trust. So you need to build your emotional bank account. You need to make those deposits, and you need to mitigate against those withdrawals. And I think, Jazi, you'll remember we spoke about the leadership credibility formula last week, and the leadership credibility formula is very simple. It equals integrity plus expertise. So I believe that to build your credibility, in this case, as a negotiator, of course, you need to focus on those 2 very important variables. And that's, of course, the integrity plus also building your expertise. There's another image that I just want to share with you. You might be familiar with this. It's called the negotiation staircase. And again, this links to principles 5 and 6. I'll come back to principle 6, but you'll see it starts on the foundation of emotional intelligence. And then, of course, the initial contact or engagement. We know to be a good negotiator, you need to be empathic. So that emotional intelligence is very important, building rapport with people. And then, of course, the 2 highest steps of this model, like we said, trust, but also the influence. And again, it's an alternative model to the rhetorical triangle of Aristotle's. And quite interesting is, of course, the spine of the staircase is, of course, listening. And the type of listening that we need to engage in to be an effective negotiator, not just to be an effective communicator, is, of course, active as opposed to passive listening. We need to listen attentively. And, of course, the highest order of listening, those of you that come from a strong communications background, you'll remind us that it's, of course, empathic listening. So you're not just listening with your ears, you're listening with your eyes, because you are vigilant and observant of the nonverbal cues that might paint a different picture. People might say to you, I agree, but you pick up in the tone of voice or the non-verbal communication, the so-called body language, that they don't necessarily agree with that. So there's incongruence between the spoken word and, of course, the non-verbal communication. We know that the words that people use only contribute 7% of the intended meaning. And, of course, you need to listen with your mind. So you need to be open-minded, and you also need to listen with your heart. You need to be open-hearted as well. So just empathic listening, I think, is the highest form of listening, which will not only make you a good communicator, but also will improve your negotiation skills. Just before we take a pause, number 6, of course, is we said it. It ties up with the negotiation staircase. We spoke about the importance of trust. In particular, we will almost reignite this when we look at relationship building. In a negotiation context, we'll look at, of course, how to build credibility. So we need to negotiate from a foundation. We could even argue that trust is the cornerstone of this negotiation process. We know that it's certainly the cornerstone of any relationship, and we know that relationships always rule the rands. So don't be blinded by the financial benefits of the negotiation process. Always then try to nurture and almost co-create and cultivate a meaningful relationship, because relationships in the medium to long term will always be more powerful than, of course, a short-term financial gain. Okay, so number 7, I think, Madeline, you said it best. We need to promote dialogue throughout the negotiation process, not dictation, and certainly not monologue. And we need to actively pursue common ground, because common ground leads to common understanding. And that's where we can reach consensus and maybe then facilitate some of those compromise solutions, etc. And of course, common understanding, sorry for saying this, I'm saying this tongue in cheek, common understanding is not always common sense to a lot of negotiators. So just be cautious in that regard and mitigate against dictating and doing all the talking. It should be a free flow of communication. That's why I said, in response to Susan's comment, that we must at some point be the director, initiating the negotiation process, taking charge and controlling and regulating the process. But at some point, we need to open up those communication channels and be more of a facilitator to find those mutually beneficial outcomes, like you said, Madeline. Number 8, the process must be objective and not subjective. And I think you will see that later on we're going to talk about the psychological and the emotional maturity. So we need to be open and receptive. And we often talk about, from an emotional intelligence perspective, we talk about the 3 R's. So the 3 R's, we need to be recognition of the emotions, the hot buttons or the emotional triggers. So it's the recognition, the regulation. We need to control our emotions during the negotiation process, but also we need to respond. So we need to be receptive, we need to be responsive, but we also need to be responsible when it comes to the negotiation process. And like we said, you need to be open and transparent, but also open-minded and not subjective, and not, like we said, Madeline, very one-dimensional and very self-absorbed, very selfish. You almost must be very selfless when it comes to negotiation. We said it, just piggybacking off the Aristotle rhetorical triangle model. Number 9, of course, the logos, the logical. We must be logical, we must be reasoned, but we also must be rational and obviously not too emotional. We do say that emotional maturity is important, but don't be hijacked and captured by your emotions, because that could ultimately sidetrack and ultimately derail negotiation process. So always try to be as logical, as reasoned, but also as rational as possible. And you'll see very shortly, I want us to look at the PAC model, where we do suggest that you need to be the adult and not the negative parent, for example, or the delinquent child, the dysfunctional child that throws tantrums, for example, during the negotiation process, or storms out of the negotiation room. That can, again, never be constructive. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time, the majority of our learning time, in fact, looking at the 4-phase negotiation process, but just make sure that the process is agile, but also make sure that the process is well structured and the process is systematic. And like I said, we're going to practically apply the 4 phases of the negotiation process. So you're welcome, just in the meantime, just to think about a typical negotiation context. How I'd like to create the learning simulation is that the 6 or 7 of you in that breakout room, I would like to regard you as a negotiation task team. And a task team, you're going to then, when you give us feedback, stipulate the type of negotiation and also the party or the parties to the negotiation process. And we're going to systematically then apply. I'm going to navigate you through the theory, but I'd then like you to practically apply it in a workplace context. Principle number 11 is we need to be collective and certainly not unilateral with our mindset and our approach. And of course, you'll see later on, there's quite a bit of literature in the ebook in particular, especially with the integrative approach to negotiation, that the principles and interests always trump positions, because sometimes the positions create what we call negotiation blind spots. And I think the synergy there is, of course, those of you that studied communication and marketing, one of the tools that we learned is, of course, the Johari window. I'll put up a slide in that regard very shortly, but just make sure that you have the right mindset when it comes to negotiation. And I've done extensive research in this, not just only looking at these 12 negotiation principles, but also I tried to look at the differentiation. What makes a poor, an average, a good, and even an excellent negotiator, and what are the sources of differentiation? And one of those sources of differentiation that I found from my research was the mindset of an excellent negotiator. Now, generally, I found that the excellent negotiator has three very prominent mindsets. First of all, they have an abundance mindset, Madeline, as opposed to a scarcity mindset. Secondly, they have a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. So, like I said, they're very open-minded, they're receptive to different ideas, different options, different proposals, and they then are very critical in how they can analyze and evaluate the merits of each of those options. And then, of course, the third type of mindset, and I think you might be most critical of this, is they have an investment mindset as opposed to a cost mindset. So they want to see the return on the investment of the negotiation process. And like you said, Madeline, they are committed then to the medium and also the long-term benefits. And of course, they focus more on sort of creating value, expanding the size of the cake, as opposed to claiming value where they just want a larger slice of the cake. So I think there is a fundamental paradigm shift that is required. So those of you that are familiar with the Johari window, for example, you'll see that on the x-axis, you have, let me just put my pointer on, you'll see that these are known to others. So sometimes it's not known to yourself, and the y-axis known to yourself. And then when we look at those two variables, it enables us to plot what we call these four windows. The premise of the theory is we need to try to open up this arena window as much as possible. In other words, it's well known to others, but also well known to ourselves. And of course, there's only three possible strategies that we can employ. So we have to increase the size of the arena window, and we therefore have to almost decrease or rationalize the size of the other three windows. And in particular, the one that I mentioned is the blind spot. Now, these negotiation blind spots, it's what other people see in us when we are negotiating, but we don't see it in ourselves because it becomes the negotiation blind spot. And of course, that sometimes becomes the pothole or the stumbling block to an effective agreement. And that's why I said sometimes people take a very firm position when it comes to negotiation, and they are blinded because the position almost overwhelms them to a point where they don't necessarily focus on interests, mutual interests in particular, but they certainly don't focus on the principles of negotiation. So the only way to reduce the size of the blind spot is then to solicit feedback from the other parties, assuming, again, the premise of the theory is that this is people that you trust and respect. So you solicit feedback from them, and that feedback then enables you to reduce the blind spot. The only way to counteract or mitigate against the facade, because the facade is then what we know about ourselves as negotiators, but it's not necessarily that apparent to other people that we negotiate with. These are almost the skeletons in your negotiation closet, if I can use that term. And the only way to reduce the size of the facade window is, of course, to open up and to be transparent and to share again with people that you trust and respect. And of course, maybe putting, you'll see in particular step 1 and step 2 of the negotiation process, where you put down the objectives, you put down the outcomes. And of course, in particular step 2, there must be a commitment to mutual and collective information exchange and sharing. And of course, the greater the generosity, the sharing from both parties, because we have to reciprocate, the greater the probability that there'll be a win-win, mutually beneficial outcome. And then, of course, the third strategy is then to reduce the size of the unknown window. So this is unknown to ourselves, but also other people don't see it. Maybe it's like a hidden talent that you have as a negotiator. And of course, the only way to reduce the size of that is then to take calculated risks, because we know that sometimes we negotiate, and of course, it's a high risk scenario, but we know the financial experts will tell us high risk, high reward. So you have to sometimes enter into uncharted waters when it comes to negotiation. You have to put yourself on the line, taking those calculated risks. And if you don't do that, you will never know. I think employment negotiations is a job, sort of interviews and negotiations that flow from that. I think is a typical example. We might all have this ambition of this dream job, but if you never take that calculated risk and put in your application, go to the interview and start the negotiation process with regards to the employment contract, terms and conditions, etc., you will never know. So I think those are the three strategies then, according to the Johari window. And I think it ties up nicely with number 11. And then the 12th and final principle, and again, hopefully you've continued to then just indicate whether you've complied with these principles, is of course the dual and the multiple competency. And this then ties up with question 1.5, where I want us to look at learning activity 1, where I want us to look at the competency profile. And we often say that not just the singular party to the negotiation process, ideally multiple parties must be equally competent in the negotiation process. Hopefully you have a worthy adversary or counterpart when it comes to negotiation process, but the higher the degree of competence, the greater the outcome. And I'd like you to think about it. We're going to come back to this principle 12 in particular, because I'd like us to craft, like I said, the second P. Once we exhaust the principles, I then want us to look at the proficiency. So in particular, I want us to look at the characteristics, and I'm going to give you the page reference number in the ebook very shortly, but you'll see there's 14 characteristics. I want us to critically review these. I want us to look at your assertiveness, and also the skill set that you need. We're going to come back to this. This is then what I call the psychology, the emotional and psychological maturity, which is then, I think, part of the competency profile.
This is Dr. Charles Cotter signing out. I'd like to say thank you for your time investment in viewing episode 3 of the Power Skills for Leadership program, which focused on the 12 negotiation principles. I'm hopeful that you've been able to extract either management, professional development, but also learning value from this particular episode. If you enjoyed the episode, if you could click on the like button, I would appreciate your support by means of subscribing to my YouTube learning channel. And not only this series, the Power Skills for Leaders, but also looking at the strategic HRM, but also looking at the management development series from previous uploads. You'll find me very active on social media, so you're welcome to follow or to like certainly some of my other content on some of the other platforms like LinkedIn, on Twitter. Also, you'll find my portfolio of SlideShare presentations and SlideShare. And also more recently, I have an Instagram, but also TikTok footprint, so you're welcome to connect. I'll certainly reciprocate the follow in that regard. I'd like to wish you the best of luck on your quest towards managerial excellence, and long may you continue to grow and prosper. Thank you. Best wishes and regards.